Ever since the Second World War, the United States has been an unparalleled world power, and ever since the Cold War, the US was the unparalleled political, cultural, economic, and military hegemon. Add in the US is historically one of the most stable and richest countries in the world, just makes the current situation even more bizarre. The US seems to be seething with internal division and hatred. Its economic and social systems seem fundamentally broken, while it proves quite inept at acting on an international scale. Meanwhile, American culture seems to degenerate, with artists like Lil Pump getting #1 hits, and with farting into a microphone seen as real music. On every level, America seems to have lost its way. This video is here to talk about how America reached its current state, what it means, and where it could be going. Again, this is just my opinion, an opinion backed by a lot of research, but you can take it or leave it. I would like us to refrain from picking one-name opponents to blame everything on. It's so easy to say that the right, left, Jews, Illuminati, Reagan, Obama, or capitalism, etc. are to blame for all the nation's ills. This is so appealing since it appeals to tribalism and makes it appear as if someone is in fact in control. Well, all the evidence from history points to all the players in every era of history being deeply compromised by factors entirely out of their control. Putin, Trump, Biden, and Xi are all bitterly struggling against a world they don't fully understand that's continually giving them bad options. Before we start, we live in a very complex era, one rich in misinformation. It's difficult to keep track of all the cross-currents happening now, and it's easy to get stuck on clickbait news that doesn't focus on the real undercurrents, which is why I find geopolitics so fascinating. I was in fact watching a very interesting documentary about US-Chinese relations called China vs. USA, Empires at War, which talked about the brewing conflict between the US and China, a multi-front, multi-continental struggle which will shape the years to come in more ways than we can count. I was able to watch this show on Magellan TV, a documentary service with a rich geopolitics section on topics ranging from the Philippine organ trade to Al-Qaeda. Besides this, Magellan is the best history documentary content anywhere. It has videos on topics ranging from the ancient world to the present. It's compatible with basically any device and has 4K with no additional cost. Click the link in the description and learn about whatever inspires you today. I'm going to take a theory from the brilliant historian Peter Turchin here. He wrote a book called Secular Cycles, using 4 European countries as a model, saying that they go through multi-century demographic cycles that affect practically every element of the society, whether on an economic, cultural, or political basis. He then wrote a book called Ages of Discord that applied the same theory to the United States. The theory goes something like this. There's an era of stability in which the population and economy grows. As the process goes on long enough, the value of labor itself goes down, as there's simply more people. This drives down the wage of the working man. At the same time, as wages stagnate, the people with money for investment or organizational ability are able to do much better, which means the size of the upper class swells. This then results in greater inequality between capital and labor. As the upper class grows and the working class is pushed towards subsistence, the pressure to get into the elite swells, and the pie inevitably reaches its limit, which results in differing factions among the elite. What normally happens is that some horrifying demographic crunch, like a major war or plague, happens which shrinks the amount of the working classes, which results in their wage growth. Which means that the upper classes and their bloated number can't support themselves, which results in the upper classes turning on each other, often with a civil war or some foolish expansionary war. America went through one of these cycles before, with it turning around in 1930, from which the quality of life for the average working man started to go up dramatically. This process ended around 1970, in which a series of demographic factors started to depress working wages. This was mainly the introduction of larger numbers of women and immigrants to the workforce, which produced a larger labor supply. This was compounded by America's population nearly doubling since the 1950s due to natural growth. Competition with foreign imports started around 1970, also depreciated American working wages. I'm not saying this was a bad thing. Countless women who would have been forced into strict gender roles and immigrants who would have lived out lives in autocratic, corrupt, and anti-growth countries got opportunities to live much more fulfilling lives, bringing their talents, imagination, and grit into the American system. However, from an economic basis, this is just true. The correlation between immigration and lowered wages in American history is far too close. People like to say that immigration doesn't lower wages since the immigrants work jobs that Native Americans don't want to, but that doesn't consider that those jobs are not attractive to Native Americans since the wages are depressed by the immigrant supply. Similarly, 80% of the revenue gained by women entering the workforce was lost by paying for the roles women did as housewives, with significant amounts being lost in food production and childcare. This is why the two working households of today often have worse standards of living than single-income households of several decades ago. On the positive side, this resulted in a revolution in American cuisine starting in 1980, with Americans eating out more. This was compounded by moving industrial jobs overseas, which shrank the supply of middle-class jobs, which meant that the demand for stable work couldn't keep up with the labor pressures, which is why wages have stagnated since 1970, while productivity has gone up by more than 70%. Meanwhile, the number of millionaires in America has quadrupled since 1980. As the life of the working man has become less pleasant and the opportunities among the elites have gone up, there has been immense pressure to get into the elite. This is why the price of a college tuition has gone up so radically, since colleges can charge exorbitant prices to get a shot of getting into the elite. A similar process is seen with medical bills, in which exorbitantly high medical bills, supported by the taxpayer under many circumstances, are a way of supporting a medical field of lesser elites. This is compounded by David Hackett Fisher's Great Wave theory of historic cycles of inflation, which I covered in a previous video, in which, due to worldwide population growth and growing international competition in the second half of the 20th century, inflation and the cost of living has grown dramatically over the last few decades as the world's population has grown to unprecedented rates. This is as governments inflate their currencies to keep maintaining their same operating costs as the cost of living goes up. This is part of a multi-century-long international population cycle that affects the whole world that should be cresting soon. I cover this in my video on Why is the World Crazy Now? These population pressures are not an American-only issue, but are affecting most of the world. Another common side effect of these cycles is rising governmental debt. This is partially to support a swelling elite with government jobs, which is one way to view the massive government outlays spent on healthcare and student debt. A cynical person could also view government bailing out industries in a similar light. The US reached a low point of political polarization in recent times in 1950. Since then, and especially since 2000, political instability has reached a fever pitch. Several factors go into this, a primary one being the conflict of the elites mentioned above in the Turchin thesis. The Democrats' main aim seems to be to place people with college degrees in as much power as possible. In an economic sense, this is through greater government regulation intervention by people who use their educational credentials against capitalists who became rich through the market. Similarly, on the cultural level, professors who have studied sociology, gender, race, queer theory, etc. are expected to determine moral behavior rather than the traditional role in America that was played by the churches. On a political level, the military and police, organizations in which people are promoted based off their talents in said field, or the old boys club, should be replaced by social workers who gain their credentials based off their theoretical work. George Friedman, in his book The Storm Before the Calm, correctly, in my opinion at least, described this group as a technocracy, or rule by experts. The Republican coalition is effectively all the other elites, businessmen who gain money through being skilled at the market, religious figures who pull on traditional value systems, military elites, etc. This effectively unites a disparate confederacy between libertarians and evangelicals that would otherwise have little in common, all of which broadly desire less interference from the government, which lets them maintain their pre-existing influence except in narrow and specific interests. The polarization started to go into overdrive with the Reaganite counter-revolution, in which the right stopped accommodating the left and took a more free market stance. For decades afterwards, the right took the stance that any compromise with the left would weaken their cause, which resulted in the left becoming bitter and using similar tactics, which created the current congressional deadlock. The left, growing frustrated with the success of the Reagan counter-revolution, decided to gain power through cultural means. This is where social justice comes in. The left has gone very far left in the last decade. You can think this is a positive move and that's fine, but imagine posting these popular left-wing opinions 10 years ago. Nearly all left-wingers would be flabbergasted. A lot of this comes from postmodernism. This is an ideology created in the 1960s by dejected French intellectuals who couldn't come to terms with Marxism's failures, and so effectively said that people weren't doing the communist revolution, since they were culturally indoctrinated by the capitalist classes. Similarly, it said that capitalism prioritized certain ways of knowing above others, and that reality, facts, and grand narratives were created by the ruling classes to oppress other groups. Every element of the culture had to be viewed through the lens of oppression, since every element of the culture was complicit in the oppressive structure that is modern society. Yes, this does sound all like a conspiracy theory, but this isn't a hidden thing. Read the documents of these philosophers and they openly say it. They say that the elements of the current culture, such as the existence of sex, ethnicity, the individual, occupation, religion, a moral code, or Western civilization, and most of the other things that people use to build their identity, are oppressive constructs that had to be deconstructed. From a historical and psychological standpoint, this is a religious conflict. The right holds Christianity and liberal values of the Enlightenment as their main tenets, while the left holds mostly social justice. There's little sense of shared worldview between the two, who view the same event through very different lenses and priorities. The Democrat and Republican parties of 2012 are collapsing due to this conflict. For the Republicans, the shared view that things like the free market, immigration, and globalization were good, which benefited mainly the elite and depreciated wages among the working class, resulted in a populist nationalist backlash on part of Trump, which effectively launched a coup against the pre-existing Republican organization, which lost any ideology apart from what Trump says. It's important to know that Trump wasn't elected for being liked. He was elected by people who would vote for anyone who was against the social order that brought them where they were. Much of Trump's policies, however, such as deregulation and continuing to inflate the currency, while pandering to evangelicals and deferring to military leadership, panders to the elites in his coalition. The Democrats have been barely able to maintain cohesion. With Biden, they've been able to maintain loose control with a leader who is the affection of the majority of their coalition. However, on an economic level, young voters disgruntled with the failures in the current capitalist system want a larger welfare system, or in classic elite aspirant style from previous cycles, government support. Similarly, the social justice wing wishes to continue to push their social agenda. The Democratic Party is like a rider holding on to a bucking horse that it can barely control. On a broad scale, with both the right and left-wing coalitions barely functioning, neither will hold for very long. Expect a complete shift in party organization soon. There won't be a civil war. There's a good chance there might be urban disturbances. The main factor here is that when it comes to force, the right simply holds every single card. The right has a near monopoly on oil and food-producing regions, gun owners, and the police. Every single civil war I know of has become more radical as it progressed, as the extremists get more power, the moderates are cut in half, and as the other side gets othered. As of now, the military normally tilts right, but has a good number of Democrats. However, the military support among the Democrats is mostly among moderates, not the far left. If things were to reach a conflict point, it would be a war between the radical right and the left, with few moderates, and thus the military would decisively go conservative. This is basically exactly what happened in Prussia in 1848. Under these circumstances, the right holds every single vector of force, and so if the left tried to rebel in its strong points, coastal cities, it would be brutally crushed. The right would simply cut off food and oil supply and send trained troops in. This has happened too many times in history to count. It happened in Germany, Austria, and Italy in 1848. It happened in Germany and Hungary in 1919, Argentina and Chile in the 20th century, Russia in 1905, France in 1871, you could even throw in the peasants' rebellions of medieval Europe. The left continually overestimates its military power since radical left-wingers tend to talk to other radical left-wingers, meaning they overestimate their military power, and they universally lack military experience to know how little military experience they have in a bizarre Dunning-Kruger. There's not a single example of a left-wing rebellion succeeding in a developed nation. This is since the middle classes, who hold a stake in society, do not support left-wing ideas of radical change and redistribution because they don't want to see the current society collapse. The main supporters of leftist revolutions are the educated elite aspirants who don't have skills tailored for the market, such as liberal arts majors or artists who consider making art the public wants beneath their honor. This is why communist or leftist rebellions have worked in poorer nations like Russia, China, or in parts of Latin America, where significant parts of the population are peasants with no stake in the continuance of the social system, and where the educated elites above can wield more influence. Developed nations universally go for right or fascist dictatorships when they go totalitarian. If there was to be a civil war, what would happen is what normally happens, that the right purges the leftist leadership, making the most radical beliefs taboo or illegal, and then most of the movement vanishes. However, what's happened in most of the examples above is that the left achieves a certain amount of what they wanted to prevent another revolt, or because the social and demographic factors are so aligned with what the left wanted to do. In the mid-19th century, for example, Germany liberalized to avoid another revolt. Regimes that faced communist revolts often had concessions to labor movements, and in the late Middle Ages, the peasants' revolts basically got much of what they wanted through market forces and concessions from the ruling class. A worry among many is that the US will stop being a democracy and will instead change to being a dictatorship. Trump's suggestion that he will not respect the results of this election are likely gamesmanship, yet still a remarkably worrying sign of America's mental health. This is a possibility, but not a dangerous one at that. The main issues are the strength of institutions in America and the continued belief in democracy. America is the second most stable regime in the world, and so power is diffused on an economic, geographic, and social level. Compare this to Latin America, where the main source of power is the landowners, and Africa, which only has a 60-year history of independence, and you see why dictatorships are so common in those areas. If someone like Trump would try to seize power, he would be deposed by the military, an organization which still believes in democracy. Most of Trump's fan base doesn't really like him so much as hate the opposition more. They're fine with him being a democratic leader in a democratic society, but would not want him as a total ruler. Similarly, the military doesn't have an extremely cordial relationship with Trump, and so would not accept his rule. A military dictatorship is far more plausible. The military is the most trusted organization in America, with support from 3/4 of the population. The military is racially integrated, meritocratic, functional, and not very politically biased. Should the country descend into a period of chaos that Congress proved itself unable to deal with, the US Army could run the country with the acquiescence of a significant part of the population. A good comparison would be Oliver Cromwell, who effectively reset the English system in the 17th century and then the democracy returned after his death, or General de Gaulle, who seized power briefly, reset the system, and then restored the Republic in 1960s France. Even though America faces all these issues, it's still in a pretty good place in many other ways. The US has very defensible borders and has an economy that could easily be self-sufficient. The rest of the world is also facing pretty similar crises, which I've covered in these 2 previous videos. If you watch those videos, you realize China, Russia, etc., all of America's competitors, are facing issues just as big, if not bigger than what the US currently faces. The US is still technologically, economically, militarily, and culturally predominant by a vast margin. A big factor here is that the US is so much more appealing to other countries as an ally than the only real alternative, China, that the rest of the world will give the US a huge benefit of doubt before they choose to side with China. China does have allies, but these are mostly poor dictatorships that want somebody to ignore their human rights record and supply them with money. For the Indians, Japanese, or Europeans, it's not really a choice. No one besides the Chinese at this point has the scale to have an economic, cultural, or technological sector even close to the Americans, simply due to size. The US will likely emerge from this internal crisis with a smaller geopolitical orbit, something I've discussed in this video, but still the most powerful nation in the world. Much of these political crises are a way American society is coping with massive technological, social, and demographic shifts that have occurred over the past few decades. George Friedman's made the interesting argument in his book The Storm Before the Calm that America has gone through 80-year political and 40-year economic cycles based mostly off generations that are ending in the 2020s. We're effectively seeing the end of the Reaganite economic cycle, which focused on helping corporations and raising capital by lowering taxes and having deregulation and free markets, which resulted in the massive labor and social issues we're facing today. Meanwhile, we're seeing the end of the Roosevelt political cycle, which deals with every political issue in the same way as the New Deal or World War II, in which you assemble a team of government experts chosen off their college degrees, and they wield massive force in single events to have the government intervene into issues. This has resulted in a fairly ineffective and overcomplicated governmental system. Importantly, both Reagan and Roosevelt were needed when they implemented those shifts 40 or 80 years ago, respectively, but they've started to have more negative than positive outcomes as the world's changed, and so we need to replace them with new paradigms. America will be a very different country in 20 to 30 years as these social and demographic shifts work through, and I'm not smart enough to figure out all the ways America will resolve these issues, but I have some guesses, however. I could possibly make a video about it in the future. God, I hope this video doesn't cost me my head. Well, if you enjoyed it, please stay tuned for future content, subscribe, comment, or check out my Patreon where I've got all sorts of cool maps, as well as the first 8 chapters of my history of the world, or alternatively check me out on Twitter. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.